another week of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. We meet every week of the academic year at this time in this room. And there's a sign-up sheet going around. If you haven't signed it already, please do. That helps our funders and other people at the university to know how well attended the speaker series is. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'm just going to introduce speakers for the rest of the quarter. So next Monday, November 26th, we have Tom Morgan coming from Arizona State University. His talk is entitled Experimental Human Gene Culture Coevolution. And then the last talk of the quarter is Amy Parrish from USC, who we have yet to have a title from. Amy Parrish, if you're listening, please send us your title. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's speaker, Jeremy Koster, who's going to be talking, he's coming from the University of Cincinnati, and talking about cross-cultural variation in the life history of human foraging skill.
Thank you, Brooke, and it's really good to be here. I'll mention that this is a work in progress. My collaborators and I are in the process of writing up these results, getting ready to submit, and so we really value any feedback you're able to contribute. Whether in the question and answer period or maybe later in the day, if you want to seek me out, have some ideas. We're really looking forward to advancing this farther. And talking today about life history theory, I'm going to start by setting the context a little bit for the way evolutionary anthropologists think about these sorts of questions. If you take a look at the graph on the right, many of you have probably seen an image somewhat along these lines. This one's a little bit outdated. It comes from Owen Lovejoy's 1981 article in Science on the origin of humankind. The thing to notice is that compared to closely related species, other hominoids like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, humans exhibit some distinct life history characteristics, right? We see a prolonged gestation compared to other species, a longer amount of time devoted to infancy, childhood. We have this somewhat weird adolescent period that doesn't have necessarily close analogs among other species. But despite an adulthood that maybe looks somewhat similar to chimpanzees, we also exhibit a prolonged post-reproductive period where even in remote societies, demographers, including some folks who have worked in this department, have documented that it's fairly routine for individuals to live until they're 60 or 70 years old, considerably past the point at which they've been reproducing. So it's a distinct life history evolution pattern that merits an explanation, an evolutionary hypothesis for how this came about, and there have been no shortage of hypotheses offered. Now, one particularly noteworthy hypothesis relates to work that was advanced by Hilly Kaplan and colleagues. This was a highly cited paper that came out in evolutionary anthropology in the year 2000, and it essentially is based around the complexity of hunting as a strategy. Right? The idea that, first of all, hunting, we're pretty sure from the paleoanthropological record that there was a transition. As we go from Australopithecines to the genus Homo, we see evidence for increased hunting in the hominin lineage. And Hilly and his colleagues were focused on, what are the consequences of that adaptive shift? One thing they'll mention is, and you can see it in the quotes that they have from the article itself, that human hunting is qualitatively different. It's a hard thing to do. It requires integrating a lot of information, a lot of environmental cues, and is maybe not something that you can do easily. And with that, then if you do, however, master this complex foraging, there are potentially considerable energetic returns, right? What you can get out of hunting in human societies, at least, can be dramatic in terms of energetically dense foods that potentially drive the distinct human evolutionary pattern, the reproductive life history evolution that we're trying to explain. Now, I'm going to draw in a few figures from that article, and what you're looking at here is, first of all, focus here on females. They show here the chimpanzee females. And they're relating two curves, the production and consumption. How many calories you get out of the environment, by your foraging, we'll call that production, and how many calories you need, we'll call that consumption. And for chimpanzees, both females and males, after they're weaned, the vast majority of calories that goes into a chimpanzee's mouth is essentially food that it has acquired by itself. There is a little bit of food sharing in chimpanzee societies, but it's much less than what we see in human societies. With human females, by contrast, here's the consumption curve, and here's the production curve. It is only after females hit their largely post-reproductive period that you start to see greater production than consumption. So if you know Brian Wood's work, other studies done among the Hadza, here you have the hardworking Hadza grandmothers who are out there acquiring extra food that could be perhaps distributed to their close relatives. With males, we see a slightly different pattern, and this is based on, by the way, studies from approximately 3 foraging societies that have been pretty well documented at that time in the year 2000. And with human males, you see instead this, as they enter young adulthood, a pretty profound difference in their production and consumption, where the typical male in these societies was producing considerably more food than he himself needed, offering some excess that could be redistributed throughout the community. Now, furthering their point, they note that in the foraging societies that they documented, you see, as compared to chimpanzees who are focusing on fruits and insects and leaves and that sort of thing, relatively lower nutrient density in those foods, you see in at least some human societies considerable investment in hunting, where it perhaps is the leading source of calories in the typical year. Now, from that, and this builds on some of what Lovejoy and others had been hypothesizing for a while, this shift to complex foraging perhaps has a number of other adaptive consequences for human evolution. We see widespread generational multi-generational food sharing, where grandparents are perhaps investing in their kids, their grandkids, a general pro-social adaptation that results in cooperation in the ways that we see generally in human societies. There's also, although it was somewhat less in this literature, is perhaps a little bit less emphasized, there's also an implicit relationship between this adaptive complex and the monogamy that distinguishes humans. I hesitate to use that word for obvious reasons, but the pair bonding that distinguishes human males from, say, a chimpanzee male, the greater paternal investment that goes along with that. Now, there are different streams of evidence that can either support that particular line of thinking or not. I think if we think about primates in general, humans are perhaps exceptional in some ways, but they also are just one member of a primate order that exhibits relatively large brains, protracted life history patterns overall. And so there's this broader question of how do we distinguish primates and the adaptive shift that characterizes and distinguishes them from other species. And there are some that have been emphasized in the foraging niche of primates in general, and how as primates focus on harder to get items in their environment, perhaps that drives their own brain evolution, life history strategies. So you're looking at an article that came out just last year in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, and they took a broad sample of primates, tried to figure out, is there a relationship between brain size in these primate species and the foods that they get. And they also considered a bunch of social variables, measures of social complexity, including group size and others. This article provides support that, in fact, there is a relationship between the kinds of foods that primates are targeting and the brain size of the respective species. In general, they focus in particular on fruit eating. So to give you just one small example of how this might play out, consider an example that was offered up by Catherine Milton in a 1991 article, where she was comparing a couple of primate species that you can find at my site in Nicaragua, spider monkeys and howler monkeys. Now, they're both similarly sized, first of all, but they have different dietary adaptations. Spider monkeys really focus on fruits, with leaves providing a secondary nutrients and secondary importance, whereas the howler monkeys are more focused on a folivorous adaptation, focusing on leaves and fruits when they can find them. But fruits have the downside, of course, of being patchily distributed around your environment, right? They're seasonally available in some cases. And to find these seasonally available, widely dispersed resources, you often have to travel considerable distance. So you can see that on average, Milton reports a day range for howler monkeys that is almost twice that of what you see with howler monkeys, right? So, but of course, we don't think evolution is going to favor just random wandering around the environment. And so there's going to be selection on these spider monkeys to have really good cognitive maps, good memories, good understanding of where to find these fruits when they need them. And perhaps that is why, despite being roughly comparable in size, we see spider monkeys in this complex foraging niche with a brain size that is considerably larger than their closely related howler monkey counterparts. Those studies are valuable. Those sort of comparative studies are really valuable, but sometimes, for a variety of reasons, it can be hard to back out of those studies sort of the actual evolutionary pattern and some of the trade-offs that would have characterized the evolution of these patterns over time. And so as a complement to that sort of approach, we also see studies like this one. This was a recent paper that came out in Nature, I believe, by Gonzalez Ferrero and Gardner, and they rely on a simulation model. And they play out a number of different scenarios that could potentially explain why we see brain size evolution in humans happening the way it does. And so they play out a sort of, it's almost like a competitive game between a number of different hypotheses that have been offered for human brain size evolution. One they'll just call, if you read the paper, they have sort of a colloquial way of describing these different hypotheses. So a me versus nature that just focuses on the same sort of foraging complexity that we've been talking about already. And us versus nature, where perhaps brain size is driven by the need to cooperate with those around you, to get the food you need, to accomplish all the day-to-day subsistence, raising kids, etc. Versus a competitive, now this is something, a competitive social brain hypothesis is another conceptual model that you've seen describing brain size evolution in primates more generally, the extent to which you might have to compete with others in your group for access to resources. We of course see that a lot with, say, Circumpothecine groups like macaques, baboons. These are model species for some of the ways these conceptual models have been advanced, versus, say, between group competition, chimpanzees competing against other groups. They play this out, and I won't go into the details on that. It's worth a read, but here's the abstract, and they highlight that the best explanation in their minds for human brain size evolution relates to these ecological rather than the social challenges, right? That if we're going to understand human brain size evolution, we have to focus on, like Kaplan and others have suggested, some of these adaptive shifts in the foraging ecology of the hominin lineage, the evolution of the genus Homo. They think there's a role for culture that wasn't built into their model in a really tight integrated way, but I think it does offer up a lot of interesting possibilities for how cultural transmission can perhaps drive the adaptive shift. So thinking about this, right, thinking about this whole literature, I work in Nicaragua. I've been there for over a decade. I work with the Mayangna, they're horticulturalists. This is one of the hunters I follow around in my observational research. And without knowing anything further about the hunters in this society, except their age, when would I expect them to get really good? When do we expect peak proficiency in how good they are at going out and getting food for their family, for others in the community? Now, if you go back to that 2000 paper by Kaplan and colleagues, I think they would, I hesitate to use the word middle-aged here. That's kind of a vague term, and don't get too hung up on the terminology. Some of us may not consider ourselves middle-aged in the same way that certain authors in this literature might. But I think there's a prediction sort of on the table that you'll see peak proficiency. Hunters being really good at what they're doing. After they've reached their peak physical strength. After they've Maybe they can't run quite as fast as they used to. Maybe they're not quite as strong as they used to be. But that their increased knowledge and experience, knowledge of the environment, knowledge of the strategies, knowledge of the prey behavior, make up for any slight declines in physical abilities and allow them to reach peak proficiency, as they approach, say, 40 years old. We heard at AAA that was an age that was offered up as peak physical, peak foraging efficiency in human societies. Now, if you think about it, it sort of lends itself to this paternal investment model, right? Where for human males who start reproducing at age 20, generously, their kids might be ready to leave. They might have a maximum number of dependents in their household, in their family group, as they're about that age, 38 to 40 years old, right? So that could potentially, according to one model, drive why you might see foraging efficiency peaking at that age when you have perhaps the most mouths to feed. On the heels of that article, there was, for a while, a flurry of studies that investigated this question. Human Nature had a whole article that was a whole special issue that was dedicated to articles around this idea. Some of the papers that were contributed were by folks in this department. Nick Blurton-Jones, in particular, contributed to this debate. And there was a lot of debate. Was it size? Was it strength? Was it skill that explains some of the age-related variation that we see in human foraging abilities? And a real flurry of articles for a while without necessarily a clear consensus, but there was sort of a sense that maybe the questions had been answered, at least by some members in that literature. And then it kind of trailed off. You don't see quite the same emphasis on that particular research question. Now, it was trailing off as I was in the field doing my own research, and so I did focal follows. I followed my young hunters around the Nicaraguan rainforest. I had a fancy little handheld computer I was super excited about debuting, kept detailed records of everything they were doing. They hunt with dogs, and that became an emphasis of my early work. This co-evolutionary relationship between humans and dogs, and what that means for both of them, both species. There were interesting questions that were emerging from that, because they didn't always hunt with dogs. There were some guys who just went out with rifles, and tried their luck in ways that you can read about in the neotropical literature. And I had this rich quantitative data. And as I thought about what I wanted to do with it, you can read other papers in the literature, right, that talk about, for example, technological shifts. As neotropical hunters first gained access to shotguns and rifles, what did this do compared to how they had hunted previously with bows and shotguns, right? And this was an interesting scenario where I could see the same hunters in some cases going out one day with dogs and their machetes. Another day they'll take out their rifle. And so there were some interesting combinations of observations. And someday they would have their youngest son with them, like a 10-year-old boy carrying the axe. Other days, we'd see seasonal variability, where it was raining or not. And so all these things that, as I'm walking through the forest, they seem to matter. And I wanted to have statistical models that would allow me to tease apart these sorts of questions. Now, so whereas others had often just aggregated within individuals, right? So I followed Brian around the forest, 15 times, and I just count up the amount of calories he acquired and how much time he was out there, and that becomes sort of Brian's measure. I do the same thing with Brooke and Susan, right? I had this idea that I was just going to model single trips. Every single trip, I was going to include that as a row in my database. And that would allow me to include all the contextual variables that I thought would matter, what technologies they had, who they were out with on any particular day. Now, I was, at the time, really focused on developing some proficiency in multi-level modeling statistics, which if you know sort of how these data sets unfold, you know that when you have repeated observations of an individual, there's often latent heterogeneity associated with their abilities, and maybe you can't explain all of it with your predictor variables, but you definitely don't want to treat them like a straight random sample that we all start with, in our basic stats classes. We have multi-level random effects models that account for some of these things, giving us tighter conservative estimates. So I felt comfortable with that part of the data structure. But the tricky thing is if you have day-to-day returns, trip-by-trip returns on what people are acquiring on a hunting trip, your histogram will look something like this, where these zeros are all the times hunters came back empty-handed, right? And then if they did manage to get something, it's going to vary. Maybe it's a big armadillo or a small armadillo or 2 armadillos and a peccary. It's going to vary, and you'll see this skewed distribution of returns. And there is no convenient statistical model that you can find. You can't run R and just conveniently find a good way of modeling these sorts of data, right? Or Stata or SPSS, whatever your preferred software package might be. So I was a bit flummoxed for a while. There were some people who would say, well, you could log in, add a constant. It was unsatisfactory. And so I was up in Davis. I had some collaborations up there in Davis, and Richard McElrath is a graduate of this department who's now working in Germany at Max Planck, and Richard at the time had been prodded into working on a stats textbook by some of his postdocs. Perry Clark in particular was quite emphatic that Richard, you should write some of these things you've been teaching in your classes, make it more broadly available. And so he was offering his stats class at the time and invited me to swing by. And it just so happened that he was, on that day, addressing zero inflated distributions. And I said, the model you presented in class is a little bit simpler than what we've got, with repeated observations, et cetera, but I'm looking for a way to extend some of these basic principles and do a tight statistical model. He said, well, I'm working with this new package, RStan, and it's great. And if you know Richard, he gets really excited about these sorts of things, and it's kind of infectious and contagious in a disturbing way. And he said, well, let's do this, right? Let's see what it would take to extend some of the zero augmented hurdle models to look at human foraging returns. And so we did that. We took a data set, wrote it up for Human Nature, and felt comfortable that this was a sound principled way of looking at this particular weird distribution of human foraging returns on a trip-by-trip basis. You can drop in all the predictor variables you want. I'm happy to go over all the details of how this works. And that was a nice contribution. And as that was coming out, though, I thought to myself, if you read this literature, you know that especially like in the 1970s, maybe into the 1980s, measuring hunting returns was just sort of a standard thing for an ecological anthropologist to do. And maybe some of those studies were, maybe it wasn't the primary emphasis of the researcher, but these data sets exist out there. They had received some attention at one point or another. And I thought there's enough of these data sets that maybe we could pool all of these things together. Maybe we could contact Kirk Endicott, for example, who had recorded a couple hundred hunting trips in Malaysia among the Batak. Can we get those data? And whereas previous generations had done some aggregated statistics, using methods that were current at the time, disaggregate them, pool them into this big data set that we're compiling, and end up with a three-level model where we consider the raw unaggregated data, repeated observations of hunters, but also within study sites to see if we can tease apart some site-level variation in the way that these life history trajectories are playing out. In his typically enthusiastic way, Richard agreed to be a part of this, and this involved a lot of emails from me to potential collaborators. And some of the faces you'll probably recognize, probably some people who have been in this room, in fact, offering up talks in the past. Some of the others are perhaps less known to you. They tend to be ecological anthropologists, sometimes conservation biologists, also record trip-by-trip hunting returns if they're doing a catch per unit effort study, for example. It was a lot of work, but we ended up with a fairly big data set. From 40 sites around the world. You can see them on the map here. A total of almost 24,000 hunting trips. And we're looking at, you can see the numbers here, over 1,800 individuals, mostly men. There are a couple study sites where we have female hunting, but it tends to be less numerous than what we have among the men. We also have high imbalance of sampling effort across sites. In other words, almost half of our observations are just from the Aceh of Paraguay, from Kim Hill's data set. The smallest number of observations we have is 6 from a site in Colombia. But our methods account for this sampling imbalance. If you dive into the random effects literature, you know that the models can basically almost weight the impacts of the site level variation accordingly. So we're not too worried about that. It required a lot of preparation and cleaning on my part, mostly, to go through and make sure that everything lined up the way it needed to. But we ended up with a fun data set. In the meantime, as I was doing that, Richard was hatching an idea to look at a different statistical approach to modeling life history variation. So the standard thing, if you read a lot of these papers, is to model variation in age with polynomials, right? So you can include age and age squared, maybe age cubed, if you want to consider extra curvilinearity in your functions. And Richard was like, I really don't like that. We know, don't we, that a baby essentially has 0 foraging skill, So, and we know that as you hit old age and senescence, the moment before you die, you probably have 0 foraging skill, right? And so he said, we don't see babies and people on their deathbed foraging, but we want a model that sort of captures, this, you get better and then you eventually get worse. So he proposed a model that's used from ecology, from fish biology, the von Bertalanffy functions of fish growth. If you work with Richard, you kind of entertain these things for a while, and then you kind of try to poke holes in it. And I said, that's fine. This is the model itself, by the way, of the skill function. This is a little more useful here. And it's the model is based on the premise that there's exponential curves. That eventually the knowledge is going to increase, but then will taper off as you get older. You don't just keep on learning more and more and more and more and more as you get older. There's also a component of senescence that eventually, we're a little, despite the terminology here, despite growth and decline, we're actually somewhat agnostic about what these processes entail. It could be declines in cognitive function. It could be declines in how strong you are. Experience is often assumed to be knowledge. We're a little bit agnostic about it, but the overall point is that you end up with a curve, like I said, that goes up and then eventually comes down for any individual trajectory through its own life history. Fortunately, despite some of the concerns of our co-authors, the models themselves are actually pretty flexible, and so you can simulate different parameters for the K parameter and the M parameter. And so you can see that depending on what the data say, you could end up with very different shapes of those curves, right? So you can end up with, in some societies, if everybody peaks early in life, if you see 20-year-olds who are so much better than 50-year-olds, the models can accommodate that. The models can accommodate situations where there is gradual increases almost all the way through late life, although they won't exhibit a real big spike, but you can see gradual growth over time. So with that, I felt pretty confident that these models can accommodate the kinds of data that we have. Now, there are some challenges to modeling these data. For one thing, Sometimes, in particular, conservation biologists are less concerned about who killed the thing and more so about what was killed. And so if you have groups of individuals going out together, then you might just know that, hey, Sean and Brian and Brooke went out and they came home with a peccary. And we don't necessarily know who deserves the credit for that. And so in those sorts of situations, fortunately, as long as we see people going out in different combinations, one day Sean goes out with Susan, then we can start to disentangle the individual level contributions to those harvests. For any particular trip, though, we assume that everybody's contributing and that we model the average skill of the group as a result. We have data on technologies used by the hunters. So we know if they were out with dogs, for example, if they didn't have dogs, my own hypothesis there, whether or not they had modern firearms or not at their disposal. We know if they had individuals who could help them by carrying things. Often these are children, but sometimes they're porters. We know in many cases how long they were out. That's not to say that we have perfect data. We don't have a perfect data set. We have a lot of missing values. Trip duration is something that's not recorded in all situations. Dogs are not sometimes recorded by the researchers, but we use some methods for averaging over missing values or modeling the missingness in a Bayesian context, and we still feel pretty confident that the other parameters are unaffected by that missingness. With 40 sites, we don't assume that the effect of dogs is going to be the same in all possible sites, and so we put random effects on that. I'm happy to share the ever-expanding supplemental information that's accompanying this article if you want to read about the model specifications. Here's the result, the first result, I should say, from that paper. If you average over all societies in our sample, the trajectory of foraging skill looks something like this. Follow the black line in particular. The orange lines, in case you're curious, there's uncertainty around all these parameters, of course, and so the orange lines represent simulated uncertainty. If we imagine a new society, what might that forager look like in that particular society? But the black line captures the extent to which we think, this is some insight we have into the life history of foraging skill. The peak, in case you're curious, is roughly at age 31. But I want to emphasize that the peak is not itself that pronounced. And already at the age of 18, you have 85% of the maximum skill that you see average across societies, and that skill is maintained all the way until age 55. So this peak of 31 years old, depending on what priors we put on our parameters, we can see that shift from 32 to 33 down to 30. You can see in the simulated data sets there are a few cases where the peak would have been earlier versus later. But it does give us some insight into, sort of averaged over all these data sets, what might the human life history pattern be? More interesting for me is when we plot out the trajectories of all the individuals, all 1,800 individuals in our sample grouped here according to the study sites. And so every curve represents an individual. So we don't have a nice longitudinal observational sample on every single individual, but we can plot out what the model predicts for their respective curves. We limit our inferences to the ages for each site where we had actually observed hunting observations. So in the Colombian site, we had only seen a couple of 30-year-olds go out, and so we only emphasize that part of the prediction there. There are some cases that have impressive time series, like the Aceh data set with its over 14,000 observations. We get to see those hunters over a long period of life. To help you make sense of this, though, the number next to the dashed line represents the peak within each site for the average hunter within that site. Okay, so in some cases, if you know Kim Hill's work, you know that he observes a relatively late age and peak proficiency among the Aceh of Paraguay. They're located here, and at 37 years old, that late peak is still evident in our sample. When we plot out predictions, the model does say that yes, the Aceh exhibit a fairly late peak later in life than some of the other study sites here. But by contrast, if you go to Peru and you look at the Matzigenka site, you can see a much earlier peak at 24 years old, which is interesting in part because in both cases they're in neotropical forest. Both cases they're using only bows, not rifles, not dogs. Well, some dogs in Peru. But we don't necessarily have a good explanation for why things would have played out differently in Peru than they would in Paraguay. We see some sites that exhibit particularly late peaks, like the Valley Bisa study site contributed by an ecologist named Stuart Marks. We still see some others where they're relatively early in life. This site from Highland, New Guinea, where we have another age 24. Now, I do think that there's been too much emphasis on peak age, however, and so one thing I also want to point out here is why do these curves vary vertically the way they do? We've standardized within each site so that the maximum is roughly right around where this last dash mark ends. And then the extent to which you see a vertical variation descending from that maximum within sites is an indication of how much hunters vary within those sites. So if you look, for example, among the Martu of Australia, there's wide variation in foraging skill among the individuals in that sample. We see wide variation in hunting skill among the Matsigenka, where sometimes the maximum skill is going to be 2 or even 3 times as great as the minimum skill within study sites. Any questions on this? Okay. Continuing, yeah.
Is there a big variation in how many individuals are in each site?
So yeah, thank you. So the numbers to the up here in parentheses represent the number of observations that we have of individual level hunting trips within these respective study sites. So I mentioned here's the Aceh. We have over 14,000 observations. The number to the left of the parentheses is the number of individuals who have contributed that number. So here we have, this is a small study done in New Guinea by Chris Healy, where we have 7 trips, each one done by a separate individual. Right. Joe, did I see your hand?
So if you look within a site, though, it looks like, is this true? There's not that much variation across ages and how much variation there is between people, right? Like, so if there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of variation across the whole.
Mm-hmm. I think it's worthwhile that you pointed that out. Like I said, we've essentially plotted out the model predictions for each individual, but in the vast majority of these studies, the data are largely cross-sectional. They were done over a single year, and so that allows us to say something like, here we see a lot of variation among the 30-year-olds, and we're just going to sort of play that out and assume that variation characterizes, the separation across all ages. But it's only with these longitudinal data that you can start to see, like, hey, you know what? There's a lot of variation among 30-year-olds, but that shrinks over time, and then you start to see these overlapping curves going in different directions. Yeah.
So are these models fitted in a way that adjusts for the ecological covariates you mentioned, or the covariates like whether they had dogs with them, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Or should we attribute these differences to those?
Okay, so to clarify, sort of a yes and no answer. What we're predicting here, what we're showing here is just the latent skill that is attached to every single hunter. So that is estimated from models that include those covariates, but that it doesn't necessarily account for the extent to which, as opposed to, say, marginal predictions, which come from generating predictions from the posterior. We do have some of those, and I could show you those at the end of the talk as sort of supplemental figures. But you're looking at essentially, if you're familiar with multi-level modeling, this would be like looking at the random intercepts themselves, which are estimated in relation to the covariates that enter the model, but that are not necessarily going to answer some of the questions you might have about, is it older people using dogs and younger people using guns, that sort of thing. So there's a few other supplemental analyses that we're adding in at this point. And one question is, do we see within sites or more generally, a convergence of skill with age or a divergence. And it turns out that at least within societies, we tend to see more variation later in life than we do earlier. So if we go back to the previous slide, this is especially evident in a place like the Valley Bisa, where you can see sort of the fanning out of the curves. In general, we're going to see relatively less variation among younger individuals in these sites. In a cross-site analysis, it's not necessarily that we see like sites where there's consistent variation, where all the young people are good, the older people are bad. We don't see necessarily that kind of variation. There's also a question of, in general, do hunters who peak early in life and exhibit relatively good hunting skill as younger people, do they maintain that skill and are they better later in life? We can look at the correlation between the parameters in the model, the correlation between K and M to answer that question. Among the Aceh, the answer is yes. We do see the Aceh sticking out here, and they're labeled separately. They're the blue distribution off to the right. So among the Aceh, yes, we generally lack the data to make strong inferences about some of the other study sites. There is a tendency, here's the 0, there is a sort of tendency to be positive in that correlation, but we are not attaching too much weight to that correlation given the available data. So just to summarize, we see skill peaking early in adulthood, a little bit earlier than, say, in particular the Aceh studies, which are to some extent because of the strength of the data, one that has been emphasized a lot. We see, a peak closer to 31, early 30s in general is what we should probably say at this point. But again, like I said, I don't necessarily think the peak merits that much attention relative to the overall pattern, which shows on the one hand a relatively flat trajectory throughout early to middle adulthood, combined with a lot of variation around that. And so we do have some covariates, Molly, but we don't necessarily have everything we'd like to have in here. We would like to know, right, how strong is any particular hunter when he goes out that day relative to his peers. We don't have some of those proximate mechanisms. But the implications of this, I think, are worth thinking about. I mentioned early on that this shift to this adaptive shift to complex foraging is often associated with things like prosociality, an increased reliance on food sharing, et cetera. And if you go back to models like Bruce Winterhalter's model in 1986, where he thinks maybe the food sharing we see in human societies relates to minimizing risk. Hunters go out 6 times in a row, they come home empty-handed. How are they going to feed their kids? Well, if they sort of operate and pool with others in their society, maybe this risk buffering strategy is part of the human adaptive complex. I think if you read some of those initial works, it sort of assumes, implicitly at least, that hunters are roughly comparable in their skill. But I think we can say pretty confidently that that's not necessarily a safe assumption here, right? And there's going to be asymmetric benefits for risk pooling for the good hunters versus the bad hunters, right? The bad hunters, of course, have every incentive to everybody throw their food in and we'll all take our share. The good hunters, not necessarily. So it makes you wonder, are there other benefits to cooperative food sharing for these good hunters who don't necessarily see the same risk minimizing consequences? To think about this more generally, I think HBE, human behavioral ecology, has gotten better about this over the years. I think for a while, if you go back to the old Kung studies, for example, there used to be this idea that can we find hunter-gatherers and treat them as analogs for the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, some model of prehistoric hominins. I think another implication here is that this site shows that depending on which you pick, you might end up with a very different picture of life history evolution relative to picking a different society. And that leads me to my final point that we do, I think, need to see I'm happy in a way that some of these recent publications have refocused our attention on foraging, because I think that has sort of dwindled from the attention of behavioral ecologists for a while. But with this renewed emphasis on the importance of foraging for understanding life history evolution, I would like to see more studies, Brian, I'm talking to you in particular, but also maybe some of the others in the room, longitudinal studies where we get to see the same hunters as a 20-year-old, as a 40-year-old, as a 50-year-old, while also measuring some of these proximate variables that are assumed to be driving the variation in their foraging skill. And I need to thank all the people who very kindly sent me their data and then fielded up a bunch of follow-up emails from me, and the National Science Foundation who gave us time to work on these questions. That's it.
I'm struck by how different it is from the curve of professional athletes who peak earlier and are out of a job by the time they're 40. And I mean, that involves more than just strength. It involves also coordination and knowledge and judging what's going on around. But so what's different about this? And can you pull out, like nobody's running out into fields and chasing animals with spears anymore. I mean, is this more, you know, of the different things they're hunting for? Can you kind of look at that in terms of the evolution of the, you know, creating the opportunity to lengthen this time of proficiency?
Okay, there's a couple questions there, and if I overlook one of them, you can feel free to chime in. But regarding the comparison of professional athletes, sure, I totally see that point. I think it's worth remembering, of course, that we're looking at the absolute cream of the crop when we see the Dodgers play, right? And that a member of the Dodgers who's 50 years old and retired for 15 years is probably still a much better ball player than like 99% of the people in the population, right? They could strap on their glove and pretty much be very competitive, probably even with college teams. And so I think I might dispute a little bit that we're looking at a very narrow window of performance among these peak athletes, and that if we think more broadly about what their foraging, well, their athletic skill might look like, it might actually resemble some of these curves. The second question was?
Well, just can you look at how people are hunting across these different places, and how much of it is sit and watch and wait for something to come and shoot it with a gun versus how much of it's running after, and how much...
So this came up in part because we were trying to explain some of the variation among the Matsugenka. You might remember they go out with bows and arrows, and there was an early peak, you know, for 20-year-olds are really good. And if you communicate with the collaborators, you know, Doug Yu and his colleagues, you know, they emphasize that the style of hunting there does require just like, there's a lot of running after these animals, right? And that maybe 40-year-olds just can't do it, or maybe they're less motivated to do it. And so I do think that there is more work to be done, thinking about the demands of different kinds of hunting and how that might intersect with life histories, and when you would see hunters, A, good at it, and also willing to take the time to do that particular activity. Susan.
I was wondering also, do you have a sense for how much of that skill is due to actual knowledge, natural history knowledge, ability to psych out the animals, and does that, I mean, it's hard to measure, I know, but...
Yeah, so this is where I really welcome feedback. A supplemental slide here. So the black curve on this slide shows the same curve that you saw previously for the statistically average forager. The blue and the orange represent data from my site, where I had one of those hand grip strength testers, right? And so that represents the orange. These are just low S curves in this point. They're not completely standardized, but we can look at the peaks and sort of where they line up. Strength is actually peaking a little bit later than you might have suspected by looking at professional athletes, for example. But the blue represents a battery of ethnobiological questions that I had asked them, in this case about fish. I'm repeating this with wildlife. And basically, I spend a week with a naturalist guide to Central American wildlife, and I flip through and I read about like what habitats these different species prefer, what sorts of foods they go after, are they more active during the night or during the day, and then I turn those into questions that I ask the Mayangna, and so you're looking here, and despite this assumption that natural history knowledge is accumulated gradually over the lifespan, I think we see instead a curve where 30-year-olds already know about as much as they're going to know about the environment.
But you're asking them basic facts about natural history that's going to come from a book. I mean, learning to think like a monkey, as I know, is something that continues to.
And so we are really interested in this question. And so to put together these questions, I spend a lot of time reading what ethnobiologists do. They're not necessarily evolutionary researchers, but they are looking to gauge ethnobiological knowledge. And if you read a recent paper of mine, I close by saying, look, I see the disconnect, that there is, being able to answer my questions isn't necessarily being on the ground in the forest and anticipating what direction that howler monkey is going to go. And I want to find ways to measure that.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any idea from watching these teams of hunters, is there deference to older people? I mean, that wouldn't necessarily mean that they actually do know more, but at least it might be an indication that they think that they are better at predicting where the animals are going to go.
So I will say that on group hunts there tends to be a leader, and I should devote more attention to sort of who that is. In general, though, what's interesting is we see sort of this assortment where it's rare for two good hunters to go out together, and so there's almost automatically like a leader of the hunt, and then somebody else who's maybe just tagging along and helping in various ways. In terms of a few occasions where I've seen sort of like group hunts, I shouldn't say too much. I think it's an outstanding question, and I can't quite get in the black box of even the leaders in terms of how they navigate the.
I mean, it'd be interesting. This would take forever to collect, but if you're planning to do a lot of field work in the future, noting when they have when they've lost the prey and they have a discussion about where they think it's going to go, record both predictions and see who is right if they do catch up with them.
That is yes.
And I know when I'm training field assistants to predict anything about monkeys, the young people are very confident but generally wrong.
Right.
And then the older, the people with more experience are way more accurate, of course.
We could potentially get some interesting predictions out of your assistants too. The scenario where this is probably most evident is Waitlet peccaries, where that tends to attract groups of guys going out together because the herds are 80 animals, and they spend a lot of time trying to interpret where their tracks are and where to go. Those only happen 2 or 3 times a year, so yeah, it's a lifelong project to even get any semblance of a data set. Brooke?
This is a little bit more of a comment than a question maybe, but I was thinking about what you said about the state of the field and how, in general, foraging studies are becoming sort of less popular and more studies of reproduction and things like that have been increasing in terms of the field. But one of the other things that's been really increasing are all these studies of social learning. And what's really interesting about this is that this finding that the variation is much greater later in life than earlier life, to me, is in stark contrast to the social learning literature, which is really biased toward focusing on learning early in the lifespan. Right? And if there's a really different pattern of learning happening at that point, where like maybe everybody's kind of learning at pretty much the same pace, kind of thing, right? And then later in the lifespan, I mean, what I can't quite tell from these curves is, so aren't there, well, in that one,
Did you want the ethnobiology?
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
I was just trying to think about whether the variation in later life is a function of strength or variation in strength or knowledge, or both. Like, is it that social learning or individual learning is sort of shifting and working in a really different way later in life, or is it that there's just that strength becomes more variable in adulthood as...
I think to pick up on that point, when we've sat down to interpret the results, we suspect that maybe it's the physical endowment, it's the strength, it's injuries or whatever that might help to explain some of this. But another important point is that, as with a lot of our observational data, these are subject to selection biases, where if we observe, if all 20-year-olds try their hand at hunting, but by the time they're 50, hunters have figured out I'm good at hunting or not, and the bad ones never go hunting, we don't necessarily see a representative sample of what...
You would see less variation later in the lifespan, right? Like as people, because
in that case, in the way it played out, yes, I would say that, but
I mean, I totally
Yes,
agree with that.
yes and no. I could imagine scenarios where whether it's motivation, another important consideration here, or whether it's a lack of alternatives, phenotypic correlations in terms of what you could be doing with your time. Bringing it back to social learning, I appreciate the point. I do. I think you're right that we would imagine that social learning should have sort of evened things out by the time people are older. And I guess that returns me to the point of variation in skill, in physical endowments, strength, stamina, etc.
Yeah. Or just that you're maybe learning, like, the same way with strength, like, you have to kind of get to some baseline before you can actually shoot a bow at all or something,
Sure.
right? And I imagine there's the same thing with knowledge, that there are kind of just baseline information that you need to know to be able to just get anywhere on, beyond zero. But then after that, there may be very different kinds of skills that you do accrue that, I don't know, either you accrue more slowly or based on the number of hours spent or something like that. Because it does seem to be something with the fact that these older people are typically our sources of knowledge, right? So what are they, I don't know at that point, maybe it switches from being really socially driven to being really individually driven or something like that. I'm not sure, but it seems like there's a gap in the social learning literature that would help to explain something.
I would agree with that. A lot of the social learning literature is, based on sort of like who taught you to hunt, that kind of just retrospective, talk about your life kind of method. I think it would be useful to look, maybe not two angles, right? Possibly just looking at sort of who's going out with whom. And so a fairly standard thing among the Mayangna is for teenagers to go out with an uncle or a dad, and that seems like a prime opportunity for them to be sort of learning to hunt, basically, right? And then another observational study where you really focus on teaching in the context of hunting, right? So we see people going out in the social learning literature and really focusing on teaching to children, but this is often within communities, fairly easy to observe, as opposed to, say, focal observations. Yeah.
Thanks, this is super interesting. I was wondering if you had data, or this was another covariate in the model or something, but the extent to which the individuals at each of the sites you've assessed are differentially reliant on their hunting returns as a source of food, and whether or not that's playing a role in sort of predicting how wide the variance is in older age.
So there's two ways of thinking about that, right? The extent to which sites in general require hunting. So I can say, like in my site, some guys just don't hunt at all, right? And that's feasible because there's fishing as an alternative. They can earn a little money from gold panning and buy meat as needed. And then variation sort of both across and within sites, right? The ideal would be, to consider some of the options available to people. If we had, for example, how wealthy is every hunter, then you might have this opportunity to say, well, wealthy hunters just don't hunt. And when they do, they're just out there for fun. They're not really, trying to, feed their kids in the same kind of way. I'd love this data, yeah. Brian.
I think, Sean, you had your hand up first.
Okay, sorry. Sean.
Did you try and look at some of the environmental traits in these populations? That might explain some of the population variance.
I'd welcome advice on what those might be. So you'll see a lot of folks looking at net primary productivity, for example, as an indicator of ecological variability. I will say that there are some differences in the research methods that have made me a little reluctant to try to be too comparable, to say this site exhibits like this pattern versus this site, and explain that with site level covariates. Just to give you some examples of what those research methods might entail, among the Warani, they were mostly focused on successful hunts, and so a lot of unsuccessful hunts got undocumented. But if you're trying to model sort of like, the average amount acquired by a hunter, you need those unsuccessful hunts, right? And so there was a lot of standardization of values within sites before they all went into this cross-cultural model. Yeah.
So Great talk, Jeremy. And it's wonderful to see this massive data set get more mature and ready to be out there in the world. It's fantastic. And I wondered, since you started with the Kaplan et al. 2000 paper, one of the big, I guess, dependent variables or traits that they're trying to account for is both brain size, but also mortality rates and lifespan. So if you could look at your data through that lens and think about what do these data suggest in terms of the marginal value of extending lifespan? Because when I look at those data and I see the peak performance, like you said, is not as actually peaked as might be thought, but also it could be distributed from the early 30s to the 40s at some time in there. I still look at all those numbers and think, okay, well, a male chimp is going to have a 0% chance of reaching any of those ages.
Right.
So we use that as a benchmark, last common ancestor kind of pattern. I'm wondering what you've thought about it from that perspective, like from the perspective of a shorter-lived, hominin ancestor that's shifting into a more meat-centric diet.
Right.
Do these data lend any insight into the
I think so. I mean, one of the earlier comments I made was how our models predict that a 55-year-old has equivalent skill to an 18-year-old. And I think we're starting to see some studies come out, I think of Paul Hooper's work among the Chimane, where it seems like some of these men, forgive the focus on men for a hunting talk, but some of these men are still very productive, producing more than they consume, even into their early 60s. And I suppose I would point to that as sort of an extension of what Haley and company were trying to model, and that despite all this emphasis on peaks, I do want to emphasize again, right? Like these 55-year-olds are pretty good, right, at what they're doing. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. Molly.
Also, thank you for such an interesting talk. I was like Brian, really fascinated by the shallowness of the peak itself and the long span of of impressive productivity. And I guess I was wondering about what it means to be at peak performance in terms of, so that's just a comment, but what it means to be in peak performance in terms of how we're thinking about being a good hunter, whether that should be your average returns or potentially whether there's this maybe other facet to it about your non-zero returns, whether there's a sort of another either alternative strategy for mediocre hunters who are not trying to go for extraordinary wins, but to go for consistency. And then it reminds me of Andrew's question a little bit of this idea of in certain conditions where gathering is less available, or there aren't these alternative subsistence options available, is non-zero the most important feature of what it means to be quote-unquote good?
Right. Two answers to that. In our earlier paper, we had set the models up in ways that we could look to see, is there a correlation between coming home empty-handed or not, and what you get when you are successful. And at least among the HA, one of our better data sets, we could say that hunters who came home empty-handed less also got more when they did come home, right? So that's an interesting question. I do think that there is some important ecological variation to consider here as well, and I'll show you a couple. We plot out in these are some of the marginal predictions, by the way, that you might have been thinking of earlier. These are our marginal predictions, and this one is the probability of success, the way that individual hunters are expected to get something or not at their respective sites. And I'll point to the Matsugenka, right? Here we have a site where there's tremendous variation in whether or not guys get something at all, right? And here's the variation among hunters in terms of what they get when they get something. And the variation is much less. And I think if we think about Peru and the neotropical setting there, there aren't that many big animals that they can get. And so if you are getting something, it's probably going to be in this 1 to 6 kilogram range. Much different than, say, what's going to be available in Tanzania or some of these other locations. And so to answer that question, just generally across sites, I think it's hard for me to do without considering aspects of the local ecology. Yeah, Brooke.
Can you go back to the one with the orange and the blue? The one where it's your
With my site? Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So for some of these sites, yours included, right, you have data across ages and then also across prey types. And I'm just thinking about the later lifespan there, where you really see this divergence between strength and knowledge.
Right.
And I'm just thinking about watching Mardu hunt, and so there's a sex difference there, right? That's sort of classic sex difference that women go for lower variance resources, right? But I'm wondering if, as you get older and your strength declines, if you start to, if you really see these switches in prey types where you're going to go for something that maybe takes a little bit more knowledge to figure out how to track, but a little bit less strength. You're playing to your own strengths, right? So like I can't sprint as fast after a kangaroo and track it for 2 days the way I used to when I was 35, but I can come home with a handful of lizards. And I'm wondering in particular, I guess, I know there's very few cases where you could make this exact thing the way you could with the Mardu, but if older men are starting to hunt a little bit more like women as they age, and so do you see them, for example, having fewer 0 days, but also you see their average return rate go down?
That's a good idea, and I hope you do remind me to look into that just generally. We've had a lot of conversations with Rebecca and Doug Bird on this, because the way they format their data, you know, they would say, like, now it's a goanna hunt, now it's a kangaroo hunt, and you know, Rebecca and Doug were adamant that does structure the expectation of the returns, both mean and variance. We didn't necessarily think of a good way to include that in this model, partly because a lot of sites don't have that same sort of differentiation between what you're going for at any particular time. Like in my site, guys go out and they hope, but they're in the forest and anything could present itself. Second, I think there are some statistically principled reasons why we wouldn't want to include sort of patch type as a predictor, because it's more of a mediator of the relationships between age and hunting success. But I think in general, one thing I can point to, again drawing on my own experience in Nicaragua, is that we do see a decline in hunting by older men, and they shift instead to fishing, which is something that women will do more regularly as well. And so that aligns with what you're suggesting. Yes?
So do you have any data, or does the data suggest at all that there's sort of a trade-off
against, you know, strength versus knowledge? Like if you are just, you know, highly above average in your fitness, can you basically afford to not invest as much in learning because you're just able to go out every single day and, you know, not have as much wear and tear on your body? Or
so college students who either study or go to the gym, for example, maybe an analogy, right? This is a case where the variables that you saw on that screen are what we're limited to. The only ones we could reliably get from so many different sites. And for ecological researchers in the 70s, it wasn't normal for them to try to measure the strength and knowledge of the individuals. But yeah, that's where I'd like to see the field go to answer those sorts of questions. Brian?
I'm wondering about when you're plotting the predictions on an individual level basis, you're alluding to the point that Molly made about what kinds how you're either including or not some of the other predictor variables. Like, for example, the period effect, where you've got, like in some cases, you know, in a minority of these cases, you have a big enough observation window that perhaps you could pick up a secular trend in you know,
use of rifles.
A bunch of processes could, you know, usually tend to reduce hunting returns, but maybe in some cases it's contrary. I don't know. But is there anything like that you've looked into to see if you can track prey depletion or temporal?
So in our initial paper, we looked at the Aceh, and they showed gradual decline in hunting returns over time. perhaps indicative of depletion of game. I'm generally trending in that direction in my own research, but the secular trends are tricky. I mean, like you can read plenty of studies, for example, of I think of Arctic communities where the younger generation is just sort of apathetic about hunting. And if you think about doing a study in an Arctic community in 1980 versus doing it now, you're going to end up with a very different picture of what the life history of foraging looks like. And so, we mentioned that as caveat. We don't have a clear answer for some of those questions right now. This has been great.